Games Workshop has put out an article reviewing the size and comparing the sizes of the old Armageddon or Epic Armageddon miniatures to the new Legions Imperialis miniatures, comparing the heights and all that, like just the look of them and everything like that. We're also going to take a look at another article from another Instagram user, Death of Rubicus, also known as the Apologistian or Apologistia. I'm sorry for butchering the name there, but I will link his account in the bio below. So let's read this article first. This is Legions Imperialis size comparison, old versus new. Just before we start reading, my name is Alex Hune, and you are watching One Up Painting. This is Epic News, and we cover all of the news for Legions Imperialis. All right. So, as we saw on Warhammer Community last week, Legions Imperialis is a game with a long and noble Warhammer history, from epic origins in the form of 1988's Adeptus Titanicus to the much larger and more recent Adeptus Titanicus in 2018, with four whole editions in between. It's always been about doing big battles with small models. And while the new models really are very small, their scale has slightly changed to match that of the Adeptus Titanicus and Aeronautica Imperialis, although, as we'll see, a slight change has major ramifications in this new wave of war. Let's see how old and new stack up. The infantry. We start with the smallest soldiers in this new game, the Solar Auxilia. Three generations of infantry are pictured here. The jungles, or I'm sorry, the figures, excuse me, I'm so sorry. The figures on the rectangular bases are Astra Militarum from the late 90s, Valhallan Ice Warriors, and Catachan Jungle Fighters. On the square bases are the original Imperial Guard. As you can see, they used to be able to shoulder their heavy weapons, but as Imperial health and safety regulations were tightened, the big guns were placed on wheeled carriages. The new Solar Auxilia infantry models are the ones on round bases, as you can see. They stand a little taller than their predecessors and pack in loads more detail. So, as we can see here, these are the. I'm so sorry about that. These are some of the Catachans, the Valhallans, and the OG Imperial Guardsmen. Like, I don't think that these guys were even classified as Acadians, but I could be wrong there. Um, so as we can see, we've seen this picture before actually. Um, it looks like these models are just slightly bigger than these old 6 millimeter models. Um, and the same goes for these ones here. Like maybe just like a half of a head or a whole head bigger than these guys, but I don't think it's very much there. So if you do have some of these old infantry, I'm sure that you could just put them on the circle base and use them just like that. Ogrins have particularly I'm sorry, Ogrins have particularly doubled in size in the intervening years. The old Ogrins to the left were substantial lads back in the 90s, but they're dwarfed by the new Charonite ones on the right, who also pack a much heftier punch with their cybernetic claws. Yeah, I must say that these ones look a ton better than these ones over here, the old ones, because well, one, the paint job on these guys is, it's not Games Workshop level. I'll just say that. Um, and two, they're all the same pose. That's like it kind of looks weird. Like it'd be cool if maybe like one or two of them, but all of them, it's a little bit redundant. Um, this one's nice. It's got just a little bit of variation in like the way that they're stepping, at least, and the size, of course. It's cool to see the big chunky guys. The models painted as Imperial Fist here date back to 1997 and Epic 40K, making them the second generation of plastic Space Marine infantry. As you can see, the newer Legions Astartes tower over their older brethren. Again, we've seen this picture too. I'd say that these guys, just going back to that old analogy that I made before, these guys seem more like the firstborn tactical Marines, and then these guys are like the Primaris, and doing that in air quotes, the Primaris equivalent, where they're just like a bit taller, a bit more modernized, even though there are still the tactical Marines. Tanks. Actually, before we get into that, let's just go over here to the apologestian or apologensia. Gentia. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I keep butchering that name. Anyway, this graphic here is really great. So that we already know that these bases are going to be 25 millimeter. So this lovely man has gone and broken it down. So here we have the red line indicates the 25 millimeters, and then it's just put vertically. Um, so if you put that in, or if you break that number in half, you get 12.5 millimeters, and then you put it next to the marine standing up here. Then you break it down just a little bit more into its individual units. So here is 10 millimeters. That's about how tall the marine is, just slightly under there. That's where the backpack hits at least. So the marine itself is about 8 millimeters, but just like a tiny bit more than 8. So this new game is going to be an 8 millimeter scale, which is great because the normal human would be 8 millimeters. So that means that puts this marine just slightly taller than a normal human, which is exactly what we're looking for here. So the old game was in 6 millimeter scale. Um, so as we can see here, that would probably put them like maybe a head or a half of a head taller than the older models, just like how we saw in this picture right here for the infantry at least. Now, when it does come to the vehicles, though, it's going to get a lot more extreme in terms of the size variation, and we'll see why in a little bit, or right now, I guess. All right, so the tanks. On the left is I'm sorry. On the left is an adorable family photo depicting three generations of Lehman Russes. At the front is a green and old metal version of the Space Marine era from the Space Marine era in the mid 90s, joined by a plastic model we think from Epic Armageddon. The new Legions Imperialis Lehman Russ kit also builds Lehman Russ Vanquishers pictured on the right with a smaller plastic version below it. Yeah, again, so like if we look at this, look at how small this guy is compared to this Lehman Russ, the more modern one. It's not a huge difference, but the difference is definitely there. And then the same exact thing goes for this one. Also, look at the lack of detail here. So it's crazy how far we've come since like the 90s in terms of that developing the software and actually just making these models with such high quality detail at that scale too. The venerable Demios pattern Rhino chassis has had a small-scale glow-up in a number of ways. First, as the Predator you see on the left next to its early 90s forebearer in metal. In the picture to the right, we have four generations of Rhinos. The chunky latest version is at the top right, next to a Hunter anti-aircraft tank and the more modern MKIC pattern from the Epic 40K era. On the bottom left, you'll see an original plastic Rhino from the early 90s, and to its right is an original pewter prototype from the personal collection of one of the original designers, painted in the first iteration of the Emperor's Children livery. Once oh, Once more we can see the contrast in terms of the sizes and the detail particularly. I think that this new Predator tank looks great. Like the level of detail is so cool for how small this model is. And this guy's cool on its own, but just when compared to that, it's just so lackluster. Yeah, and again, like if you compare the sizes of this Rhino to this one, it's it's not like a huge difference because obviously they're small minis, but the difference is definitely there. Like look at the size of this, like just individual parts, like this back like top hatch compared to this one. It's like a third of the size bigger. All right, now we'll move on. The Bane Blade. Once we approach the super heavy tanks of the 31st millennium, the gap in scale really begins to make itself known. Here we see the new Baneblades stacked up against several patterns of the original model from the early 90s, which were in fact the first super heavies in the Warhammer history. In gray, in gray is a storm sea. Oh my goodness. In gray is a Stormhammer, in green a Baneblade, and in black and yellow is a Shadow Sword. Yeah, here you can really tell the difference. Like this thing is tiny compared to this big old, uh, what is it called? Baneblade. Um, like this looks like a Rhino compare or like a Land Raider compared to it. Titans. As we arrive at Titans, the change in scale becomes almost remarkable. Yes, these two models are both Warhound Scout Titans. The one on the left hailing from an era of epic Armageddon, and the one on the right from Adeptus Titanicus. The older Warhounds, which weren't available to photograph, are of similar size to the smaller God engine. Yeah, this is a big size difference. Now I don't think that this this like type of model, like let's say that we were to equate the 8 millimeter scale to this guy, right? Like this seems like a big jump, and that might just be because infantry was like sculpting was different back then. It might be because the Titan sculpting was different. I'm not exactly sure, um, but it is just interesting to note the sizes as we continue here. The current Reaver Titan is almost literally twice the size of the older versions. The one on the left is from 1989, and the one on the right is circa 2003. However, you can't fault a purity seal as absolutely massive as the one pasted to the leg of the original Reaver. Surely there is none purer. That was my comment, man. I made that note. I noticed that in my one of my videos. Um, but yeah, this is a huge size difference. If someone was wanting to play this in a game against me personally, I don't know if I'd like be okay with them proxying it as this Titan because the size difference is just it's too immense, man. It's like half the size. Um, Now like if he or she, I guess, wanted to proxy it as this Titan, if I'm not sure if they're the same size or not, but if they were, like I'd be okay with that. But this one is just yeah, that's kind of crazy. Same thing here. It's like this thing's like almost double the height, man. Just proxy this as the warlord or whatever the heck it is, whatever like it's relative to its height. The comparison between warlord titans is immense. The one on the left is the original Lucius pattern warlord titan, released in 1997, though it wouldn't earn that specific designation until much later. On the right is the current warlord, or I'm sorry, on the right is the current towering warlord, which could probably just kick its puny ancestor to death at this point. Personally, I'd like to see this guy actually done, like redone in a modern and bigger scale, or like in line with these guys, because I'd actually really like the look of this Titan. Note that none of these pictures have been digitally manipulated. They were all shot side by side on a white studio background. So the big takeaways from this article and apologencia. I'm sorry, I keep having to sound out that word. Um, the big takeaways here are the size increases for infantry and vehicles, obviously, but mostly for older vehicles. So your infantry are probably going to be just fine to use. Um, Space Marines might be pushing it a little bit, but as long as you put them on these bases, I think you'd be okay. Um, but as for vehicles, when you're in the smaller vehicle range, it's probably not that big of a deal. Once you get to the Baneblade size and Titans, it's you're really pushing it. Just probably if you do have those older models, proxy them as Titans or Knights that are appropriate relative to their current model's size, I'd say. But yeah, that's about it for this video. Again, I'll put links to this blog post in the description of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you again to this Instagram user's permission for letting me use their articles. Um, yeah, thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video. If you'd like to see more of this content, please subscribe. And thank you guys so much for watching. Happy wargaming.